Hello, welcome back to a sunny day in the East Nuke of Fife, which I think is pretty much how I start all of our podcasts because it's just been so sunny of late. Anyway, today's conversation is with Dr. Rose Hejtmanek, who is an anthropologist and the author of The Cult of CrossFit. And Katie's work investigates cultures and processes of self-transformation, so she looks a lot at wellness culture and fitness culture. And so while her first work was on CrossFit, I think even if you're not interested in CrossFit, you're going to enjoy this episode. I think if you've ever wondered why modern workout trends often end up feeling more like an identity and how that kind of lies at the heart of a lot of the wellness culture. I mean, CrossFit were the first to do it, and I guess a big part of why they're shrinking now is that we're seeing others tap into that, what CrossFit did, and recycle that message. I'm thinking about High Rocks particularly, but I mean there are loads of other examples. And then there's lots in here about online influence and culture that I think will chime with you. Katie explains a lot about sort of how counting reps and sets can slide from kind of useful data into a sort of moral audit. I thought it was a really fascinating discussion and I think you'll get a lot out of it. Anyway, there's lots in there and I'll see you at the end.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I am here today with Dr. Katie Rose Hejtmanek, and Dr. I guess, well, can I call you Katie? Is that
Yep,
okay?
please.
Okay, so Katie is an anthropologist, and you'll hear a bit more about her in a second. But I saw her book when it was published. She published a book called The Cult of CrossFit, which I thought was really interesting. And I read it over the last few weeks, and it was a great experience for me because it made me think about my own history as a CrossFit coach, and also a lot of my own thoughts about health, fitness culture, maybe modern internet and influencer culture, and just she pulls in so many different strings. I thought it was a great book. So after I started to read it, I thought it'd be really great to have her on, and she very graciously said yes. So, Katie, thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for taking the time to read my book, and I appreciate that you appreciate it, that you enjoyed it.
It was great. You like I said, you have so many references, and you sort of, and I mean this in a good way. You pack in so many different lenses in the book. You kind of have this historical lens, obviously anthropological, sociological, and you hit so many different points in the book that it's about so much more than I initially thought it was going to be about. I mean, I think you have your main thesis in the book, um, but you also just there's so many other threads going on that I thought it was great. I think even for people who aren't interested in CrossFit specifically, it has a lot to offer. But I wanted to give you a chance to say hello. So, Katie, who are you and how'd you get here?
I think the key points are, yeah, that I'm an anthropologist. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and kind of a subcategory of that is a psychological anthropologist. And so I study people and culture and meaning, and I'm interested in that around the world. I started early research with orphans from the genocide in Rwanda in 2004. Started researching that. Also did some work with child soldiers in Uganda. Ended up doing my doctoral work in a mental institution for children in the United States. I lived in they call it residential treatment. So I lived in an institution for about a year and a half for my PhD, and then have done a number of other smaller projects, but then pivoted to the CrossFit stuff. I'm also somebody I've taught a lot. Even though I'm highly educated, I have a PhD. I also have been a self-taught person. I sort of done my education kind of in weird spurts. And so I kind of understand myself as somebody who learns interestingly and differently. And specifically, I'm a kind of a kinesthetic learner. I like to use my body as my main means of learning. And so I've really incorporated that into my anthropology in general. I'm a professor, so I teach. I'm on sabbatical this year. I'm living in Tbilisi, Georgia. I got a Fulbright, so I'm here doing some work with Free University in Tbilisi. But I spend most of my professional life teaching undergraduates and writing books and articles and kind of thinking about the world from an anthropological lens, which is always sort of trying to understand the meaning we give it. We give who we are, how we are, why do we do what we do, and thinking about that as a shared phenomenon rather than just a personal, individual type of thing. So I I'm also a weightlifter. So I'll talk a little bit about this, I think, at the end, but I sort of identify as an athlete as well in terms of who I am as a person.
Writing about CrossFit in a way almost feels like a departure from some of the previous populations you looked at. So I would kind of like to know how you decided to look at CrossFit. And you weren't a CrossFitter before you started doing the research. Were you a weightlifter? Can you just kind of talk about your sort of your athletic and your I don't know, your relationship with fitness and physicality before you started the research, and then also how you decided to look at CrossFit?
Yeah, so the through line through all of my research, as a psychological anthropologist, we are interested in the boundary between the self and culture. So where does the self end and culture begin, and vice versa? Because if we're all in families, right? So you probably are very similar to a sibling, but you're also very different. And then also culturally, wherever we live, not everybody is exactly the same. And so psychological anthropologists are kind of interested in what we all have, what we all share, and how meaning of our lives is like shared phenomenon. And also how that gets it kind of internalized, embodied in our emotions and our thought processes and the way we move in the world. But then also, we are kind of also distinct individuals. So we sort of do these things independently. So psychological anthropology kind of is that interesting boundary. And I've always been interested in kind of the self transformation. And so so the orphans from the genocide, it was like an orphanage and institution. Children were being sent there and they were trying to be taught to be Rwandan rather than Hutu or Tutsi, which was a very important identity. And Rwanda was this ethnic identity. And so it was like this idea of how do you take a part of the population and transform how they experience themselves as something very different than what is sort of part of the cultural milieu. Same thing with the mental institution, was getting children to taken out of society and put in this mental institution where everything about their lives was organized in this institution. And they were taught to identify different sensations or feelings in their bodies with new emotions and then behaviors. So they're learning to identify, maybe they act out when they get sad, and so learning to identify those feelings of that they when their mom doesn't come to visit as sadness rather than anger, and then asking for a hug rather than attacking somebody and violently kicking someone. And so the whole process there was about sort of learning a new affective repertoire. And most of those children were Black children, Black and brown children in the United States. So also there's this kind of dynamic of like who gets to feel which emotions, and how people read emotion on you. So what you feel and say is very different than maybe how somebody sees you feeling something. So, but that all is this internal experience that these children had to learn over these 18 months was the average stay of learning to kind of interpret this really individual experience, but then also understand it in a larger, not only family dynamic, but then a cultural dynamic and social dynamic of like, as a tall Black man, do I get to be angry? How do I, and what do I do with that? And how do I have to fear if someone else sees that and interprets that? And so the CrossFit stuff was like the next iteration, where some of that other stuff was involuntary self-transformation, was sort of imposed on children who are oftentimes prime targets for like projects that change people. And the CrossFit was kind of like a point of intervention. I looked at different strength sports, but this idea about a voluntary commitment to self-transformation. And so when I first started the project back in 2016, I started with strength sports more generally, powerlifting, CrossFit, weightlifting, and strongman. For a summer, I joined all 4 gyms and I was very, very strong by the end of it. But I was interested in kind of like these different groups and like what, that kind of looked like. And I found that strongman, weightlifting, and powerlifting were more sports kinds of things, where CrossFit was like this whole other thing. The ideology, the culture, people talked about it differently, the community. And that to me as an anthropologist was like super interesting. And I had been racing track and field. I'd been a sprinter for Central Park Track Club. And so I'd been going regularly to track practice, and I was in the gym lifting to be strong, to be fast on the track. And so I was like around a team. And as an athlete, as a member of team, you kind of go to that team practice, you do it. And yes, you worry about other things, but it doesn't kind of take over your life in the same way that some of the CrossFit stuff took over people's lives. And the way they talked about it as it took over their lives. And so over that summer, the anthropologist in me was like, oh, that's really interesting. That's the thread I want to pull on. And so I will stop the track and field and kind of commit for the next intensively for 2 years, and then for about 7-8 years total, to this regimen of CrossFit to sort of to change my own body, right? You can't just watch people doing CrossFit, you have to actually do it. So I joined the gyms, a couple of gyms in New York City, it's where I live, and committed to it. And then kind of, I can talk about the methods of anthropology, but then kind of just sort of did all this ethnographic methodology for a number of years to be able to kind of understand. And then every time I went anywhere around the world, I stopped in and dropped in at a CrossFit gym to kind of get a sense of what it was like elsewhere. And then I had a sabbatical in 2018, and I spent some extended time in India and Australia with a short detour through Hong Kong, to sort of immerse myself a little bit in CrossFit culture elsewhere.
So, I mean, 7, 8 years, this is a real long time to immerse yourself in, in a culture and a community. And I guess when you were going in, you sort of, as you alluded to, you knew quite a lot about exercise culture and strength and conditioning and stuff like that. But I think you're right. Like with powerlifting and strongman and everything, it feels much more like a community of practice, like a sort of more of like a classic sort of, it's a community, but it's something that you see in other sort of hobbyist circles, where this is how people spend their time. And I think there is and was something about CrossFit specifically that seemed to be more all encompassing. Quite conscientiously, I think it was designed, to have these sort of religious aspects, which I think you'll get into. Um, so what kind of themes emerged? Like when you first started going to CrossFit and starting to wrap your head around it, what are some things that hit you? And then what sort of threads eventually evolved into the thesis of your book?
So one of the first things that I was told when I went into the CrossFit gym was that it was going to change my life, and that without asking me any questions about who I was or what I was doing, there was like this, from CrossFitters, from coaches, from anybody, it was like this idea that I was there and this was going to save me. Um, and that was either because I was a college athlete or a high school athlete that had gotten, as an adult in your mid 30s, gotten kind of lazy and sitting in front of the computer as a professional, that I'd gotten out of shape. Or if I wasn't an athlete as a kid, that I would tap into this new athlete that was in everybody, and I would kind of come to see myself as an athlete. Um, and I had been racing on a track and field team. So I was like at Penn relays. I had like Olympic athletes on my relays. Like I was training, and I was doing like masters, which is like in track and field is over 25. So anybody 25 and over is like an old person in track and field. And so I was competing as like a mid 30s person in track and field already. And so it wasn't like I was looking to get a pull up. Like I was doing 5 sets of pull ups, 5 sets of 10 pull ups at the gym already, strict pull ups. So I was very strong already. I'd been, I could squat 225, no problem. Like I had, for reps, like it wasn't anything, it was maybe a little high, my squat. But I was strong. And so this idea that it was going to somehow transform my life, save me. And I say this in the first chapter of the book. At the very end of that chapter, I say I committed to it. I liked it. I did it. I wanted to understand it. And I spent years of my life doing it and trying to understand it, from a place of non-judgment as an anthropologist, but it didn't save me. And I think that point is why I can say some of the things that I can say, because I kept a little bit of a distance. And I also noticed as an academic, a lot of people writing in academic circles or journalists, or like a lot of people do it first and then start to study it. And so I kind of went the opposite direction. It wasn't something that I did that I loved that I started to study. It was something that I kind of went to study and did it, and committed, but I didn't, I never felt like, that it saved me. And the saving is like a really important part of the puzzle for me. And so that was like the first thread, of how I came to see how CrossFit was really different than other fitness or sports, actually.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, I wouldn't say I had a similar experience, but the way that I kind of stumbled into CrossFit, it was interesting because I always felt, I'm saying this, I was a CrossFit coach for about 10 years, but I always felt like I had one foot in and one foot out. I also didn't have that experience of being saved, and I never proselytized. And I think it's probably just because I'm sort of skeptical of these things anyway, and I didn't really grow up religious, and I don't think I'm wired that way. And I think that some of the same mechanisms that a lot of people have when they join a religion or whatever, the social dynamics, I think for whatever reason tend not to click with me. And it was always very interesting being in there and being a part of this culture. But then also maybe because I did a bit of anthropology in undergrad or something like that, I always kind of felt like I was an undercover anthropologist. I'm like, what's going on here? What is happening? What are these dynamics? Um, so your book is called The Cult of CrossFit. And I think if we're going to talk about this idea of the cult of CrossFit, it's obviously it's such a loaded word, and different researchers from different methodologies and practices will have a different definition of cult. So I was just wondering if you could talk about why the book is called The Cult of CrossFit, and then maybe we can start untangling some of those themes.
So that is because of my publisher, to
I
be honest.
I thought it might have been, yeah, I
Yeah.
thought it might have been. I had that.
That was not the original title I proposed. It
What
did
was the
not have
original title?
Red, White, and CrossFit, because the book is really about American CrossFit. So it was like
Yes.
Red, White, and
Mhm.
CrossFit, and then I said it was like stories and heroes and like this other. It was like a very academic title,
That makes a lot
and
more sense to me. Yeah.
and they came back and were like the cult of CrossFit, and I was like, it's not. And because of our contested understanding of this word, right? And I knew it would alienate a lot of the people that I studied, and I told them that, and I knew that it would be clickbait, because that's kind of what. And then at the same time, I started chapter 1. So introduction is not labeled, but chapter 1 is on the cult of, the kind of community. And I start with a excerpt by Greg Glassman, who like is really kind of ambivalent about the term cult. Like he's like, I don't know if we're a cult. That cult's a bad word, but maybe we are, because people love it. And I get, fine, I guess we're the cult of the caveman. And so it's like and that's the ambivalence. And it's, in the 70s, the term cult like kind of was mobilized to talk about some really dangerous stuff, mostly Christian, mostly kind of, suicidal, or, some really extreme Christian ideology with a group of people. And it was a pejorative. No one wanted to be in a cult. No one was, and then drinking the Kool-Aid as like this term as somebody who's brainwashed into something to kill themselves or other, and then by now, like I actually was contacted by at some point, during my research, during the later part of my research and before the book came out, about how successful CrossFit was and how could other people be cults, like how could other things, and an Airbnb there, the founder of Airbnb was like, how to make your brand a cult and the culting of brands. And so this idea that now it's like something that you want so that people hashtag you and kind of are devoted, right? And I think that's a key part of it, is like this devotion to this brand, which is very economic. It doesn't have the same pejorative. So I think it's a very complicated term. And that's just kind of in the CrossFit or the like economic world there. And then, but there's also like, lots of fitness stuff like yoga. There's also people who like, if there's a charismatic leader kind of kind of get sucked into is, certain kinds of uh practices, culty. And so I think it's sort of like one of these terms that, gets thrown around a lot. And you can kind of cult of CrossFit, and I'm not the first that comes up either. So, it's not, and then, and people would say that they'd say, I drink the Kool-Aid, I've drunk the Kool-Aid. And so that's also this like interesting, without saying I'm in the cult, they would say I've drunk the Kool-Aid as like a proud kind of disclaimer that they were kind of this loyal, devoted member. And so I really kind of think about it as a beloved community. But
And actually, could you expand on that? That when you say beloved community, you're using a specific term here. Can you kind of explain what that means?
so we often, the first time we kind of, the popular version of beloved community comes from Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and his use of it kind of for the Black community in the United States. But it comes from like the late 1800s, and this American philosopher named Josiah Royce. And he was kind of talking around the same times as other philosophers, American philosophers, who were really interested kind of in this individualism. Like William James was like this whole cult of individualism, to use the term, in the United States for like the entrepreneurial individual spirit that America was cultivating. And Josiah Royce was sort of kind of pushed back on that and said, no, I think there's something about being part of something else, a loyalty to a community, that you sort of, and that this feeling of loyalty to this community is above the self. And so he called that community that people feel as above themselves, that they're committed to and devoted to, a beloved community. And so that's where it's like, and I think that's how CrossFitters really see it. They see this, and they're very devoted, almost like through pain and suffering, to this beloved community that of fellow sufferers who worldwide, in their box, in their 6 o'clock p.m. class, in their partner wad, all these different kinds of communities that kind of come from CrossFit, but they see it as a sense of a beloved community.
I think you're right. I think that sense of commiseration is really important for building those bonds. And I think that's something that Glassman was very aware of, sort of the magic of the, sort of the Metcon, and getting people to this sense of suffering together and then coming out on the other end of it. Tying in with themes of transformation and a lot of sort of the Jungian archetypes of going into the underworld and coming back changed. That we've seen for a long time. I I like I think that lens makes much more sense to me, this idea of a beloved community, and then, tying into some of, Tocqueville's observations about civic organizations, or, Robert Putnam's work. Just to me, it always made sense to me that, CrossFit filled a hole for a lot of people who sort of felt a sense of enemy, or enemy, I guess, and a sense of just wanting to be a part of something. And whether or not cult was the right term, it's sort of irrelevant. It's something that ended up becoming a huge part of people's lives, a huge part of their social lives, and arguably even their civil lives, which I think is something we can talk about more. It's interesting what you said about the original title, because that makes much more sense to me, kind of situating CrossFit in the context of American history and American religious movements. But also physical, we'll say fads, I guess. And I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about that a little bit, because this idea of entwining sometimes overtly religious themes with physicality, but sometimes just sort of implicitly as well. I'm thinking of, Turner Halls and muscular Christianity and physical hygiene movements, and all these things that are not unique to the US, but do seem to be a big part of American culture. I was just wondering if you could kind of give the audience just kind of a loose overview of where CrossFit might be situated compared to other previous movements in American history.
So I think a great place to intervene, not necessarily to start, but to sort of like put our pin down, is this framework of New Thought theology, which, right, theology, like how did we get there? But it's sort of a newer form of specifically American Christianity that was all about the body. And so, and it was in this, it was like a late 1800s, 1880s to 1920s that was kind of a formal iteration of American Christianity that sort of pivoted from some of the history of the United States is that it was sort of founded from European, Dutch, British, English settlers as a place for religious freedom. And that, that's kind of, and I talk a little bit about kind of narrative in the book, this idea that's an official story that was American freedom. When like the underlying code, the actual real reality was that there was too much religious tolerance in those places, and they actually wanted a lot more strict kind of Christianity in the United States. So it was actually founded to be a lot more Christian than where the people were coming from. And so so this idea that the United States, and it was going to be founded before the end times, like this was like to create a new Jerusalem, a new, stronger, more stricter Christianity to prepare for the people for the end times and for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And then it became, a business, right? As a colony, it became, there was a lot of business deals, and that's also sort of part of our story about American as a place for entrepreneurial capitalism and not as many laws. And so that kind of comes into CrossFit as well. But it's sort of this idea that, that was kind of from the Lutheran or from the Calvin kind of Christian sects, and those were European. And then, over, a few decades, there were different revivals. And then there was like something that was like very evangelical about American Christianity. It was a personal relationship with God. You didn't need to go through any bishop or pope or, head priest that, a lot of this coming from Europe had those hierarchical situations. And the United States was like, you could have it in your house, you could have it as a book club, and that the whole point of American Christianity, especially, Protestant Christianity, is that you had a personal relationship with God. And that personal relationship with God became this embodied experience. And so what you put in your body, how you used your body, all became sort of like this flag of how pure and good and moral and Christian you were. And so that kind of so Weber wrote this book called The Protestant Ethic about Calvinism. And that kind of really resonated with early Americanism and Tocqueville. But it was like the next iteration where it's like this personal relationship with God, and that you could, as keeping yourself pure and clean with food and diet and movement and sweat and color, right? The whiter you were, so you're staying out of the sun, was sort of like actually you were kind of getting closer and closer to Christian ideal and moral sort of cleansed soul. And that was and then New Thought theology was really kind of in this, was sort of like the American version of that. And a lot of the early fitness instructors, so Bernard McFadden and some of these early kind of people who were in the Turner movement, or this idea of walking. And this was at the same time as some of the Barnum, the sort of circuses at the Coney Island with the strong men and strong women and that kind of stuff. And so there was this early link between New Thought theology and sort of early fitness in the United States, especially. And that sort of, it was at the same time as muscular Christianity, which came from England and was sort of had a little bit more of this structured English church kind of framework. But that was infused in sports. And so you could link a muscular Christianity with sort of sporting activity. And those were also very gendered. New Thought theology had almost exclusively women leaders. A lot of the people writing were women. And then in the muscular Christianity was the masculinization of the Christian church in the United States. So from early on, there's been, the United States has always kind of, you'll find a Christian agenda. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but you'll just find this sort of idea about preparing for an afterlife, or making a good life, or living a moral life, or, living a fulfilled life, is kind of has these Christian undertones in it. I call it cultural Christianity in the book. So it's not necessarily like a go to church type of a Christianity. It just kind of, it's cultural. It's just kind of everywhere we look. Um, and then, it's sort of, and then that kind of stuff gets taken up in our formal scholarship, like disciplines like psychology kind of took that New Thought theology and made it positive psychology. And so it was like all this whole process of like kind of thinking about the body. And this, one of the key sort of points about the New Thought is sort of this idea of mind over matter. If you prayed and thought about it and had a good, disciplined life morally, like in your mind and through God and through Christian God, you could do anything. You could heal yourself. So New Thought theology, a strict version of that is Christian Science. The Christian scientists don't go to physicians or the medical establishment. They pray for healing. And so, but this idea that you could think yourself healthy has roots in a very Christian, very, very American Christian phenomenon back in the 1800s. And then we see that all the way up until today, right? You can kind of look at any Instagram, lots of Instagram influencers, Maha stuff. It's about, if I think positive thoughts, which is New Thought theology, repackaged.
I'm going to skip ahead in some of my questions because I think that is a really important point. And actually, I think that's where I'd like to spend a lot of time in this interview is kind of how that new thought um, has influenced, or maybe it just happens to be a sort of convergent evolution where these ideas come up again and again and again. But sort of, yes, in some ways there's that conflation of health with virtue, or virtue with health, which we see quite a lot. And you talk about it in the book as well. This idea that if people have health issues, that in some ways, if not explicitly, in a way, it's your fault because you made bad decisions, or you spent too much time on the couch eating too many carbs, as Glassman might have said it. And I think that is probably a good direction to go into. So I'd like to look at some of the other threads in your book. And I think if we're going to talk about this, we also need to talk about um, all this happening, especially in recent times, especially post-war, of these different ideas floating around in the context of neoliberalism and different forms of capitalism. And you talk about this explicitly in the book, where you sort of talk about the different, the importance of like these sort of founding mythologies and these myths about how certain movements start, CrossFit being one of them, but the different forms of capitalism that are part of this CrossFit story. So I think we should bring that in. And then I would like to, maybe start talking about influencers and online fitness culture and Maha and things like that, because so many of the ideas you have in the book have almost in a way metastasized outside the scope of CrossFit, outside the scope of America. And it's almost like this is the culture we live in now. So let's talk about capitalism. Let's talk about the different kinds of capitalisms that you sort of identify, and you coin some interesting terms that I think are useful, and then we'll go from there.
Um, Absolutely. So I talk about Oracle capitalism and garage capitalism, kind of under the umbrella of neoliberal capitalism, but also kind of as unique American sort of versions. The Oracle capitalism is sort of I spent a lot of time with books on Oprah, because Oprah could like say at one point she said something about not eating beef anymore on her show, and like the stock crashed and she was sued by a bunch of cattle ranchers and out of Texas, and she was in Texas for like a big old lawsuit, and she could just change markets. She's like the pre Taylor Swift kind of market maker. And so, but she had this idea that she was doing good TV. She was doing positive TV. So in the same kind of positive, think mind over matter, think good thoughts. She kind of came off new agey, but she had her roots in, as a preacher's, she preached as a child in a Protestant church. And so she would just kind of like had this sort of practice of like, this oracle, and the oracle we sort of can trace it back to, oftentimes it's traced back to Greece, and it's a woman who's kind of divining something. And that, kind of saying like, this is what you need to do. And so we have in the United States kind of that, that has been we'll have a charismatic leader say something's really important, and then it kind of can be sort of taken on as like this own sort of market driven thing in and of itself. And Oprah really did that first, right? Tim Cook has Apple. He's not Apple, but Oprah's Oprah, full stop. And I thought Glassman kind of operated that way. He wasn't, so CrossFit kind of became this thing, and he wasn't as succinct. He didn't sort of brand it in the same kind of way that Oprah did, but he wrote journal articles. He had a website when it was first, like when the web was like early, the World Wide Web was new. And he gave out free advice. And then he did he taught teachers, and then you could open your own box, and all you had to do was like, so it was like he kind of created this model, and that he had this sort of like really important thing to say about strength and conditioning. And this was at a time when, like, he kind of came up kind of saying, I was in these gyms and I got kicked out of all these gyms, and he was really doing it right. And people tried it, and they, it changed them. It was really hard, or whatever it was. And so it kind of like, he sort of, was able to kind of make this like early web community a thing. And people could post on the, the CrossFit website, and, find other people doing it all over the world. And so that was like this, kind of the first, yep.
I was just going to jump in for people who know the history of CrossFit. I think this is such an important point. I think the CrossFit website probably went live around 2000, 2001, and they posted these workouts, and this was old message board culture, so people could chime in, they could talk about what their times. You knew that everyone around the world were doing the same workouts every day. Um, and this is pre Web 2.0. So what I mean is, this happened before Facebook. This is before social media. So we kind of hit it at this time where you could almost develop, I'm not going to say monoculture, but you could have this sort of galvanized community who's all experiencing the same thing at the same time right now, which is so hard nowadays with modern social media, which I think we'll talk about. And I made this connection in your book, which I hadn't thought about before. But like, Oprah was sort of like the pinnacle monoculture influencer. Like, we're never going to have another Oprah, just just in the way that we'll probably oh, sorry. shows how to touch him. The musician, who am I thinking of? Biggest musician in the world. You just mentioned her.
Taylor Swift.
Yes, Taylor Swift. Thank you. Taylor Swift in a way might be like one of the last of these like monoculture sort of celebrities, because she kind of started before that. So she still has this huge market impact on things. But I think you're exactly right. CrossFit sort of emerging in the early 2000s, just before, I'm not even gonna say the modern internet, but maybe before like the silver age of the internet, was really big. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I just thought that was a really good point that the audience should know.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. No, thanks for interrupting me. And it was like, and that's where workout of the day came from. Glassman went onto the website every single day and put a workout that everybody could do for free, and that you didn't have to pay him. You didn't, there was no monetization of it. And people posted message board. It was great. And so, this is, again, it's hard to imagine. This is before a visual image of an Instagram fitness influencer showing you how to do it. So it was like crowdsourcing from the comments, like how to do it. So it was really like very organic in the community that it sort of fostered. And a little bit about Greg Glassman. So Greg Glassman was like this. He was a gymnast as a young person. He went to college, dropped out, was a personal trainer at a bunch of gyms. He was out of Santa Cruz, California. He was the son of a system scientist, a man who had a PhD and worked for the company that supplied the Department of Defense in the United States. And so he was kind of trained as a young person to like look for data. His dad, one time, he asked his dad a question about the length of like a screw, and his dad had him measuring all of the lengths of screw in the garage. And so so he also had like this libertarian mindset, this college dropout kind of. He's a white man, kind of rogue, California frontier, like tough, gymnast, athlete kind of a thing. But then he also got has a limp. He like injured himself, and so he's not like he doesn't look like the when you think of a CrossFit Games athlete that's just super jacked and muscular. He doesn't look like that. He kind of has a pot belly, and but he's just kind of he's used his mind to sort of mobilize this fitness world. And then he has other avatars that kind of you know show the look of it. And the look of it actually kind of was also in early 2000s, was post 9/11, the war on terror. And the new sort of pivot for the United States is like, we need the military in a new kind of way. And so CrossFit in California was located near some bases, especially some naval bases. And so they got associated with some sheriffs in Santa Cruz, Greg Admonson, and then the Navy SEALs at the Navy base, not too far away. And so they started training military personnel and first responders. And so instead of this, kind of older, sort of not as fit looking man as the face of CrossFit kind of became the US military and special forces folks.
Yeah, and that's big. And I'm thinking of some of the people like I was going to say Josh Bridges. Josh Bridges, I remember, he's one of the first superstar athletes. I think he was ex Navy SEAL, and obviously Dave Castro, and and the aesthetics of it as well. This was really the put an American flag on everything era. The sort of the birth of the tactical, that sort of fetishization of special forces and the operator culture and all that. That's all really entwined. When I cut you off, and actually what you're just talking about, Glassman, it fits into, I think, the second form of capitalism you identified, this garage capitalism. So actually, I think that fits in really well. Can you kind of explain this idea of garage capitalism?
So yeah, the Oracle capitalism kind of was this kind of ripe moment with the web, with the 9/11, and with this guy who was kind of this rogue, I'm tough kind of person. And then the US military and being fit. And so this idea that this person could then tell you what to do and you would follow him. But it's also kind of garage capitalism is sort of endemic in the United States. If you hear a national narrative project about the United States and any of our companies, it was always a college dropout who started a company, especially the technology companies, in their garage, tinkering away, making something that they could then, bring to the public. And so that story, Disney, Apple, Hewlett Packard, everything kind of comes from this sort of like this space. And there's a great book called Garage, and it's by an artist and an architect and a sort of cultural studies person that looks at this place. And it's sort of the garage, you have to be wealthy enough to have a garage. So it's sort of middle class, but it's outside of like the home. So it's, it's not as nice as the rest of the home. And it's kind of like this man space. And it's sort of this empty canvas to turn whatever you want into it. So it could be, there's like commercials where you go to the garage and it's like the first man cave where it's a television and a couch and a motorcycle and a dog all watching the game, with a beer fridge. But sort of, and CrossFit kind of emerged out of Greg Glassman's parents' garage in California. And California, so near Silicon Valley, kind of the rougher, tougher kind of sister to Silicon Valley is that Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is like the tougher kind of the Brooklyn of Manhattan, the Santa, of that part of the country. And so, so it has this sort of, aura and this mystique as like this place of like innovation, and this place of kind of, masculine innovation and rough and tumble kind of stuff. And so he mobilized this sort of framework to sort of sell it. And he had this journal that he published online, or you could send him a note and you could get it in the mail back because, email wasn't too much of a thing. but like the second ever version or second ever volume was how to convert your own garage to a gym. And there it was, I encourage anybody to look at it. It's quintessential CrossFit, because it's like you're going to be kicked out of garages. You could play your own music. It's already like you're not using what's in there. If you don't think you have the money to do it, you need to reprioritize your health and fitness over everything else. Who cares about your car? Put it under a, tarp if you have to, but you need to commit yourself to this sort of space of masculine reinvention, um, in particular, kind of a temple to the body and the soul. And so he kind of mobilized both of those things under our neoliberal capitalism, where where people could then he made it into, okay, how can I not just make my own garage, but how can I make my own CrossFit gym? And so he kind of, but I think Glassman didn't do it in the same kind of other way that a lot of like franchises work. And I think he did it in a much more sort of, this is the cultural Christian way. He did it in a more of a congregational church kind of way. If you want to put a franchise up, of Lifetime or Anytime Fitness or any kind of franchise, you have to, it's a large monetary commitment. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars, because you have to, it has to be the same color, it has to be the same brand strategy. And you have to buy all the weights and the machines and all this kind of stuff. And so that's a huge barrier to entry for most people. And CrossFit sort of started. One guy just wrote him and said, "Hey, can we have kind of our own box up here in Seattle, almost like a kind of like a studio, like a jiu-jitsu studio? And how can we do that?" And Glassman was like, "Pay me $500, and you can use CrossFit." And then it became where you had to, in order to create your own CrossFit gym, you had to take a level 1 training course. And then that was like $1,500, $2,000. And it was a weekend, and you had to pass a test. And then you could go open your own CrossFit. And then it depended, its particular flavor. Like, you would put CrossFit in the name, obviously, but it could be, CrossFit Tbilisi. And so you knew you were in Tbilisi, you knew it was a CrossFit gym, so people would know how to get there. But then you tailor it to your local community. You make it, in Brooklyn, it can be, there's Black owned Brooklyn gyms. There's like, double income, no kid Brooklyn gyms, Brooklyn CrossFit gyms. There's, Wall Street gym that's, with the Wall Street crowd. And so you have a different flavor, that is tailored to the local community. And so people aren't going there to look exactly like everybody else. They're going there to kind of have somebody who sees them as a community, and have it be kind of the local brand and blend of that community. And that's like a congregational church. It's like it's very democratic. The people who are in the church get to vote for who is in charge, and the vote is sort of with their dollars with the CrossFit gym. And so it's kind of, and that's the libertarianness. That's kind of that's less neoliberal, because it's not, CrossFit has become more neoliberal now. We can talk about that in a little bit, but it had this other. And so part of the fun of being a CrossFitter internationally, and I think, Andrew, your whole experience is like, you could go to, like, the whole point was to like travel as a CrossFitter and have like t-shirts, and go to the CrossFit Thailand, go to Hong Kong CrossFit, go to, places all over the world to get their local flavor.
Yeah, I remember feeling like, you were part of something, and I feel ambivalent about Glassman overall. But I do have to say, for any of the misgivings I have about him, I'm not gonna say at a personal level, but maybe some of his specific beliefs. He always is someone who had like he had integrity. And what I mean is, there was a real consistency to his ethos. There's that sort of, like you said, that libertarian model, that is sort of like a congregational church model, where obviously he used affiliates instead of a central franchise. And HQ was always sort of this interesting organization, and sometimes they would say inflammatory things, but people always felt like they had quite a lot of freedom. It's interesting, as you were talking, it really made me think of Malcolm Harris's book, Palo Alto, where he sort of talks about the California ideology and the birth of the myth of Silicon Valley, and this whole garage capitalism myth, and it got me thinking. And I think we'll talk about this in a few minutes. As you mentioned, Apple. Um, I was thinking specifically about Steve Jobs and Steve Jobs, his death ultimately, and of cancer. And there's sort of those famous anecdotes that came out towards the end, and they may have been apocryphal, but how he decided not to pursue, traditional medical treatment for a form of cancer that was supposedly treatable, and kind of thought, well, actually, I think if I just drink smoothies and eat enough fruit or something like that, I'll be able to see my way out of it. And it's, you know, that art in a way is kind of so similar. You see this sort of California ideologies, this Palo Alto, Silicon Valley culture kind of play out in the story of Glassman. Um, so I think that's really good now. So we've kind of talked about some of the ethos of CrossFit, and I think that's really good. And you brought up one thing that I think is worth bringing up. I'm going to kind of jump to a different idea now, but I think it's important. You were talking about Glassman being the son of a systems engineer or systems specialist, and this idea of measurement, that anecdote about him measuring all the screws. And in your chapter, when you talk about science CrossFit style, you bring up some really interesting points on this idea of focusing on numbers and using numbers. So you talk about Sally Engle-Mary, who I'd never heard of before, and talking about this idea of enumeration and applying numbers as a way of applying values to things. And then also Michael Power's idea of audit systems. And I think this is important whenever we talk about the fitness industry, inside or outside of CrossFit. This love of metrics. So it's a bit of a jump, but I think it's such an important topic for the way that we think of, well, even social media is all metrics based up to a point, and datafication and things like that. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that and how that stood out to you.
Absolutely. So when the first couple times I went to the gym as an anthropologist too, it was like people always wanted to know if I ate paleo and if I like did this sort of rigorous sort of uh, datafication of my fitness. Because as a scientist too, so CrossFit has two forms of science that they really kind of mobilize, and one is this kind of we count, it's evidence based or empirical, and because we count numbers, and then that it's evolutionary satisfying, like this is what we were made as humans to do. And it's really interesting because both of those, kind of so much anthropology studies those both of those things. So this idea that Sally's work kind of came out of England in this sort of focus on how schools and hospitals and businesses really needed to kind of focus on how can we quantify if we're doing a good job, which is all outcomes measures, like though that's kind of a term that people use, audit, enumeration, and that sort of tracing that history, I sort of kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with that. Like, where did this idea of like quantifying our movement come from? Because now we can't get out of it. Like, how many steps did you get? What's your sleep score? What's your, all of these numbers, what does your Whoop tell you? Your readiness score is. And that actually comes from like the military academies in the United States, 1813, and West Point, the Army, was a way to sort of like grade essentially cadets and how well they were doing. So it's like a grading system, like you want the best cadets who are, earning top marks to go to the best posts. And so they just kind of started to figure out a way to tally um what the work was. Now if you just tally a work, that's kind of data driven. But if there is like a target you're trying to achieve, like a grade, or like a cadet is trying to get a good post, there's like a moral valence to that. There's like a better way to do it, an A, right? An A plus, or a C, or an F. And so this idea of and they called it, right, it's what's called audit. That's kind of an audit culture of like, how do we assess? We can mark and we can grade, but then we try to achieve a better grade than others. And Henry Ford really kind of also mobilize this in his, and this was kind of scientific management. It was what it was
Yeah, and
called.
Taylorism as well.
Yes, in the Taylor version, which is like the Ford kind of capitalism version of it. So you have the cadets and then you have the capitalisms of it. And it's like there's always this like, now we have like the Amazonification of it, where it's like, how fast can you do everything and you don't take a break, to achieve your goal. And so this idea of enumerating all of that towards a goal is audit. It's not evidence. It's not data driven. It's not scientific. It's not, because there is that moral code of trying to do better and better. And so Glassman, like this idea of, I consulted physicists about, because Glassman really mobilizes physics and math, and I'm doing science and math because there's like all these different definitions of CrossFit, from, it's a philosophy, like 100-word definition to, you know, uh, increased time and modal domains, right? All these kinds of frameworks.
Definitions of work and power, yeah.
Exactly. And because he kind of came from this background, he could talk the talk in a way that got people like nodding along. And then every once in a while he was confronted by somebody who was actually a scientist or maybe an engineer and pushed on these. And he he fought back, and he's like, I really like debates, but he shut it down really quickly and kind of really sort of focused on like his definition, and that it was really science, and I'm really doing math. We got a bunch of science guys, which he meant his dad. And what we're really doing is science. And they were the first to do it. And he pushed this. I'm giving you these definitions of exercise. I'm giving you these definitions of fitness. And almost because they was like kind of out there in the ether, outside magazines, strength and conditioning journals, like didn't define it. And so he was like, CrossFit defines it. We achieve it. This is how you get fit, and this is how you measure your fitness. And really, it's just kind of, he just found a way to like, you write down your scores. How much did you lift in the squat? Did you do 5x5 at 135? You write that down. And then how fast did you do the WOD? And you write that number down. And then you keep this tally of these numbers so that you can prove to yourself that you're collecting data on yourself, and that you can prove to yourself that you're fitter. And if you do CrossFit, you get better at CrossFit. That's 100% true. 100% true. Does it make you fitter? Again, it's like these, the work capacity over time, and modal domains, there's no physical entity or physical, physicists don't do work capacity. They do work. And over time is sort of implicit, right? Work is over time. And then modal domains, okay, that's like push-ups versus running a mile. But increasing that increasing work capacity over a broad time and modal domains is the moral intervention. That's where it became not science, but a moral audit culture.
Yep, and that's actually a good segue to what I wanted to talk about next. But it is really interesting what you were saying about this auditing, and does it transfer, like this idea of work capacity, does it transfer to real life? And it's not the point you were making, but I remember when I was pretty good at CrossFit, and you shared some of your numbers. I'm going to be honest, you were better at CrossFit than I ever was. Looking at some of your Fran times and stuff, I was never an exceptional CrossFit athlete. But I was always disappointed when I would train CrossFit and I would go do other things, and I would realize actually, oh man, I haven't really gotten any better at this. Like obviously, yeah, okay, my back squat has gotten better, and what are my Fran time and everything like that. But it was interesting in that I still had this sort of awkwardness of movement. Like obviously, it didn't make me better at dancing, which is a different thing. But it didn't necessarily make me better at like climbing or bouldering. I had the capacities. Okay, well maybe my upper body strength is better and things like that. But I was always it was interesting because for everything Glassman talked about, it was still a very highly prescriptive philosophy where it's like, look, these are the movements, and officially, CrossFit could be anything, but really it was like the same whatever 15 canonized movements over and over and over again, your thrusters, and maybe doing whatever, a hang power snatch or something like that. And it was amazing because so much of it was based around the assumption that you're going to use a barbell, you're going to use this bit of equipment, And I just remember being so disappointed where after I'd done CrossFit for X amount of years, I still couldn't do a cartwheel, even though I could do a handstand walk. Which is just to say that, in a lot of ways, it was, it was kind of myopic in a way to kind of say, well, we're going to define fitness. This is fitness. And, we're going to have these amazing athletes display it in the CrossFit games. But I think sometimes people lost the forest through the trees. That's just my own observation it made. It took me a while to kind of realize that even though I was fit in a CrossFit sense, actually, I didn't have all this transference I wanted to real life.
True. And that's, I think I want to kind of intervene at that point. Like, that's also because he linked it to human evolution, that this is what humans were built to do and to be. That's a kind of problematic, right? So if you're saying this is fitness and you have to be, in order to realize your human genetic potential, what you would have looked like a million years ago, humans weren't around a million years ago, that you have to do CrossFit. It then took on this sort of like, again, this sort of moral code of like human evolution and this peak of human evolution, peak of survival of the fittest. And then all of the really elite games athletes, the ones who everybody saw as like these amazing, you know, goddesses and gods, were all white. And so it had like this really kind of implicit kind of like link between CrossFit, human potential, and survival of the fittest. And that the people who were really good at it were like these Icelandic women who were blonde and blue eyed. And then, and that was really kind of an obvious sort of like moral code.
I would like to talk about the CrossFit Games. I don't think we're going to have time in this interview because it's one of the things I did want to talk about is the emergence of the CrossFit Games and sort of some of the internal politics because even though Glassman didn't really formally leave the organization until I think 2020, I definitely got a sense that with the Reebok endorsements and then Castro's emphasis on the games, that it turned into something very different when it turned into more of a brand and more of a top down. And that's interesting. I'm not going to follow up on that because I think there's some other things in the book, and you did a good segue. You were talking about the sort of the moral dimensions of being physically able and capabilities. And I think for me, one of the most interesting chapters in the book was talking about this idea of being prepared for the apocalypse, and the zombie apocalypse, and where this idea of apocalypse or end times or rapture or God or Damrung or Ragnarok or whatever, where it fits in the CrossFit mythos, and how that kind of ended up butting heads with COVID, with lockdown and the various ways that different governments responded to COVID. So it's gonna be a two-part question. Don't worry about the second part. What I would kind of like to interrogate right now is this idea of being prepared for the apocalypse, and also how these sort of historic, not historic, how these heroic narratives, this idea of heroes, kind of fits in to CrossFit, and then we can jump into the other question later.
So what that, along with being saved, one of the first things I heard in the American CrossFit gyms was this idea of who's going to be on your team during the apocalypse. And that if you did this kind of activity, which was based on human evolution, you would be able to survive the apocalypse because you'd be able to pull yourself up and, do all these things to outfitness, the apocalypse. And the apocalypse is like kind of the birthplace of the American nation state experiment. And at some point, the first article I wrote was published in American Anthropologist, and it was called Fitness Fanatics. And it was exercise as answer to the pending apocalypse. And it was like on this sort of zombiness. And in Brooklyn, outside of sort of Christian traditions, the zombie apocalypse was what we were training for. And everybody just kept talking about it. And I was like, that is so weird. And it was one of the first things I talked to my anthropology colleagues about. And then whenever I traveled, nobody else, like I would, would go to places and people would like kind of cut corners. They'd shave reps. They'd not run as far as they were supposed to. And they didn't have this like intense, like we are training for the apocalypse. Like the only person you're doing a disservice to is yourself because you're not going to survive the apocalypse. But it never came up anywhere else. And so I was like, I really kind of thought that was interesting. And no sport I have ever been a part of has mobilized apocalyptic frameworks. And so this was a really interest in any other fitness kind of tradition. And so I really pulled on that thread. And so in the United States, like at some point when I first started doing my little searches in 16 and 2017, I found a like the Center for Disease Control in the United States had a middle school zombie apocalypse preparedness page, right? Which was joking, tongue in cheek, but it was also like on the official website. And so it was really interesting. And, at that, and this is, post 9/11 fears. We had a huge, like, post 9/11, we had a ton of zombie Hollywood television shows, the Grateful Dead, right? All of this stuff kind of came out. At the same time, we had tons and tons and tons of like superhero movie and television shows. And so at the same time, like there was a reckoning in the United States, this new fear, not of nuclear war, but of like towers crumbling down. And so how were you going to prepare to like sling somebody over your shoulder and get out of the way? And so there's, this idea that you would be able to outfitness this monster that was coming for you. And in that is like sublimated, I talk about like sublimated like fears about terrorists and non-white others kind of coming for our jobs. And I have another piece coming out kind of in that same on anxiety and CrossFit, kind of like this idea of like your economic precarity, that people do CrossFit as like a practice, as like a gamification of precarity, so that they can like figure out how to like mobilize all these different mental and physical strategies to prepare for like a hard work day. And so there's like this kind of, but that like really took hold because in the United States, we have so much apocalyptic kind of, it's kind of cultural. It's everywhere, right? It's on the street corner. It's at our CDC. It's in our movies. And CrossFit really mobilized that. People were in this 9/11, in this is the fitness for our special forces, kind of like prepares you for tackling that. And COVID happened, and this crazy, end times sort of seemed to be upon us. And a lot of it was to, stay at home if you had the privilege to stay at home, and, not make things harder for our healthcare professionals who had to heal the sick and nurse the sick in the hospitals. And CrossFit, as like this libertarian, as like this kind of like, alienated masculine kind of fitness regimen, was like, no way. Our whole mantra is off the carbs and off the couch. And here we are, everybody's making banana bread and we're sitting on our couches for 20 hours a day. And so how do we like, and that's not what we prepared for. Like we prepared to out fitness zombies. You're asking me to be quiet and calm and safe and inside for my less privileged others. And it like was a flashpoint in especially in the American fitness CrossFit community. CrossFit gyms stayed open. They were really resistant. They like, other ones kind of had like a library lending kind of thing where they would lend their equipment out to people. And you could take different equipment and use it while they had like Zoom fitness, classes. So there was like different strategies in different parts of the country. I spent a lot of time in Alabama during the pandemic, which is near a giant military base, Army military base, and their gyms were open. Everything was closed, but like swimming pools and gyms. It was amazing. It was like kind of the opposite of everywhere else in the country. So their CrossFit gym was, with their military personnel, was like up and running. And so, there was just kind of like this, if we've been preparing for this apocalypse, this is not what it was, kind of, that is not what and as libertarians, don't tell us what to do.
Yeah, it's not the apocalypse we were promised. I think of the idea of things end not with a bang but with a whimper. And it's interesting because I think people have this idea, especially in America, like you said, there's this looming idea of this like big explosive apocalypse, and then we'll all be living the Mad Max universe, and it's a form of wish fulfillment in a way because people like to imagine they'll be scavenging the wasteland and like fighting people and sort of like building up their own society. But it's one of the things I think about. And I remember Patrick Wyman, he talks about this in terms of like the sort of the long collapse. And a lot of other people who think about this, they think about this idea of catabolic collapse, which is generally when societies start falling apart. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in things like the roads aren't getting repaired, the taxes aren't being collected like they used to. Suddenly, olive oil is more expensive, and Wyman talks about how nobody knew that they were living through the decline of the Roman Empire. You just sort of see it in public transport, well, maybe not public transportation back then, but just things stop working. And that doesn't fit with the apocalypse that they are preparing for, because they wanted this sort of hero opportunity to show how capable they were. And you talk about this really well in the same chapter, actually, where you kind of talk about this tension between neoliberal ideas of health and fitness versus sort of public health model. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, like in terms of who was more successful during
Well,
the.
just in that, this neoliberal idea of you need to be active and you need to exercise, and that's going to be your way to wellness, where actually the public health model is sort of about working together and thinking about the needs of the population, and how sometimes contributing to the community doesn't look like fighting zombies.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, absolutely. So, during the pandemic, as I was like kind of working on this book, a colleague of mine who's a biological anthropologist who studies kind of metabolic health with reindeer herders in Finland, and I did a survey on COVID-19 perceptions of mental and physical health and well-being with the stay-at-home orders, like the shutdown of the gyms and other physical exercise spaces. And so we had a survey of about 500 people, and so we could tell, like, kind of, and again, it's perceptions of well-being, perceptions of mental health. But in that survey we found that overwhelmingly women did so much better. They perceived themselves as more mentally healthy and well, their well-being was better, and their physical health was better. And this is at the same time when they're staying at home. They're oftentimes take on a lot of the household labor and the emotional labor and child labor, as well as doing the work of their jobs. And so it was interesting to kind of see where they talked about that, and in the survey, because it was both quantitative and qualitative. But we found that women were so much better, like statistically significantly, like hands down, understood themselves as better. And what we found was, like, in the qualitative data, was that they quickly, like, they oftentimes, besides CrossFit, a lot of times women are the ones who work out in fitness groups, whether it's an aerobics group or a yoga class or whatever, it's class based. And so they quickly had numbers, maybe from going to coffee afterwards, of all these other women that they knew from their classes. And they would meet up outside to do fitness, whether that was go for a walk with their babies, or whether it was go on a bike ride, or whether it was meet and do some push-ups at the, in the park. But they quickly mobilized those networks to be outside and to be together and to do whatever it was. And nobody had a high intensity. Everybody was like, all our high intensity is down. And that's okay. What we're trying to do is stay sane. And so we have this great piece in Ethos where it's like pre-COVID was like, I want a PR, I want to be this, I want to be that. And post it was like, I just want to feel joy. Like, I just need to not murder someone, right? And so it was like these really different, stark differences between the goals and motivations, and then how they've kind of found it. And we had this brilliant, like, male qualitative response where it was like, this guy was like, it was like, I realized that my friend biked and I biked, and we could actually bike together. Or if we couldn't do that, he could bike a route and I could bike a route, and we could see who did it faster. So it was like, all of a sudden, it was like it took them 6 months to, like, come up with this together. Even if they, like, met with a bro at the gym or they did a CrossFit class, like, it was like this idea that they didn't have that connection to others to gamify it, or even just, to talk. And that one, like, really interesting sort of like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it. It made life so much better, they said, like, in that quotation. And so that was really an interesting data compared, the CrossFitters did better because they did it in a class and they kind of had the Zoom stuff. But in general, our gym goers and our non-gym goers, like the women, just really, because of this connectedness of it.
Yeah, the genesis of Wild Strong, the organization I'm a part of is interesting because it came out of that period. And it's exactly right. Jill, who founded it, she sort of identified that there were all these, really female-led groups, these sort of social connections, um, who were willing to make things happen, and that was it. At first, it was groups of women and wives sort of coming out into the woods, finding fields, and sort of exercising, like you said, much less emphasis on the intensity of CrossFit, but just being outside, enjoying movement, touching grass, as people say. And it was interesting because there's always a 6-month lag where first, like, the women sort of make it happen, and then, I'm talking from personal experience, and then slowly you see, like, the husbands and the boyfriends and everyone start coming in. And I think there's something very powerful about the connections that I think maybe women are better at making and maintaining for this kind of organization. There's a lot I wanted to talk about, but I think we covered a lot today. But I do kind of want to talk about some of the future projects you've been thinking about, because a lot of the things that we wanted to talk about today that I didn't, like influencer culture, this marketing of femininity, and sort of how CrossFit kind of changed that, and even some of, like, the performative influencer culture about femininity. Like, I'm thinking about things like trad wives and performative motherhood and all these things. And they're things that you do sort of touch on in the book to a certain extent, but we're sort of in a new environment now. It's 2025. 2020 feels like a long, long time ago, actually. So I was wondering, could you kind of talk about what you're thinking about now, what some of your future projects are?
It 2020 is so long ago. Like 2016 when I started this project, even like from when I submitted the book right before it was like the new changes in CrossFit. Like it's constantly happening and it's just so much faster. Um and CrossFit really really pushed a lot of this stuff, I think, into space, into new fitness sort of like audit stuff and um barbells at gyms that women use, and that kind of stuff. And then to that, there's been this backlash of the trad wife, of like something, of like women who kind of, there's like this full circle, almost kind of the Venn diagram kind of people who are anti-science in some kind of way, kind of finding, kind of the human evolution part of it, like the Liver King, or this idea of like, kind of health outside of vaccines, or that you can juice your way to health and cancer free living. And I think that's a really, we're in this really interesting moment, in the United States, and I think in a lot of places, of like, how do we understand expertise? I think that's a really important part of it, and I think CrossFit, kind of with this whole science, in that science chapter, with that whole science bit, sort of was an early is an early precursor of this, like, I did my own research kind of a thing, where if you Google a couple of things, and, but actually, like, the difference between that and someone like me who has like dedicated years and knows how to read scientific articles and does scientific research, like, the difference between those things is very, and yet, like, yes, science is always changing, but that doesn't mean that some of it's bad. So I think that, but this idea that there's like a tradition, there's like a human kind of, and this is where the human evolution kind of part also kind of comes back in, that there's a particular way to be a better human, that, that is traditional, right? In very conventional gender roles, women were not made to lift heavy, they were made to bear children, which, if you look at the human body, like the female body, like, bearing children is the like hard one of the hardest things to do, right? In every system. And so I think that that's like a real, and at the same time, there's like a little bit of a, well, in the United States, there's also this, like, we had this Dobbs decision, which left the reproductive rights to the states, which then certain states took those decisions away from individual women and their doctors. Um, and so I'm actually interested in that, with women who are older, who are leaving their reproductive lives. And if we are placing primacy again on the ability for women to reproduce, as like what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a good woman, what it means to be a worthy woman in the eyes of the society or people in power, and that you have people then moving out of that. What happens to that kind of subset of people, especially because men can reproduce for a very long time, and half of human female lives are in non-reproductive capacities. And so I'm interested in kind of that larger question. So this is kind of like that self-transformation again, a little less voluntary for women, right, to go through menopause and perimenopause, but then how to think about that as like a new experience, especially in this sort of social world where so much about our healthcare is focused on the ability to reproduce. So I call it like post-reproductive lives. And what does that look like in this? Women are finding influencers on Instagram and TikTok telling them different kinds of medical advice, almost because they can't go to their doctor because that's being surveilled by the government. And so it's like this really interesting moment of like figuring out how to navigate reproductive and non-reproductive lives for women in the United States in this moment where it's being more surveilled by the government. And also there's more free information in the public domain, and trying to figure out how to actually know which is good and bad information.
The idea of expertise and also the idea of rejecting certain narratives is really interesting. I think you're right. I think CrossFit was at the forefront of that, and also paleo, to be fair. And I think with all my misgivings of paleo, especially the more extreme versions of it, like the basic tenets of it, I thought were fairly sound. Maybe I mean, obviously it's a silly name, and you can't say that there's one diet that applies to all human history. Blah 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 blah. But like, if the basic tenets, I don't know. You're right, because it's tied into class things and availability of good food and all that. But anyway, like the basic message of eat plants and meat and not too much processed food, I thought was like pretty good overall. But it was interesting because that really came out of, like, you think of like Gary Taubes and, like, people starting to really question the food pyramid, and people questioning like a lot of the classic dietetic advice and things like that. I think that is, for me, that was like, yeah, when a lot of the cracks started to emerge, and people kind of rejecting certain things. And you're exactly right what you were saying about this idea, well, do your own research. Yeah, but science is complicated. Science is a process, and I think people, when people talk about scientism, where like people, again, they like to take the trappings of science, and they like to sort of turn it into this absolute truth, which is never the nature of science, because science is a process, and it's changing, and it's about disconfirmation. And I think so much of this, people don't want to have their beliefs disconfirmed. They just kind of want to have this whole yes and sort of improv circle of like, yep, that's great, and definitely, vaccines definitely cause this, and anyway, it's yeah, that's actually that's one of the things when I was doing my master's in public health, I was looking at the rise of conspiracism, and how it also sort of ties to online groups, and how it also ties into different beliefs about science and things like that. That's a whole that's a whole can of worms, and I go back and forth on it as well, because I think I find myself like falling into these thought patterns all the time, and I need to reevaluate them. But I mean, all that sounds super interesting, what you were talking about. And because there's so much I wanted to talk to you today, but I want to be respectful of your time. I'm going to let you go, but I would really love to have you back on in the future, as you start to think about that sphere, and think more about influencers, and specifically women in sort of different phases in their lives, and how social media does or doesn't speak to their needs. But really, thanks for your time today. Thanks for going over. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else people should know before we send off? Do you any other projects or websites or anything that I should point people towards?
I have a project where I'm actually working on a new book for this which is a more non-academic, that's on estrogen and fitness. And I do a workshop for that. So my website is www.drkatierosehejtmanek.com, where you can see the books and different articles that I've written, but then also this kind of workshop, which is kind of looking at kind of the really kind of this individual self culture sort of dynamic for women, and kind of in this sort of moment, making it less about even the physicality, but even about kind of our molecules, like who we are molecularly, which I think kind of ties back into the longevity movement. And so if people want to reach out to me and tell me, their stories or find out more information, then they can do that. But
I think that'll really resonate with our audience. I think there's our audience is predominantly women in their 40s and over. So I think that's a topic that will be very personal and meaningful to them. So thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, for this opportunity. I appreciate your time and effort and the conversation. It was a lot of fun, and hopefully your audience will appreciate it. So thank you for.
Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and hope we can talk again.
Yeah, me too.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Hi, we're back. There's lots in there. I think I need to go back and listen to the Matthew Wemsky episode because I think they sit really closely together in terms of the the cult-like feeling of a lot of wellness culture. If you enjoyed that, please do share it with somebody else that you think might enjoy it, or leave us a comment or a review. That would be great because it really helps spread the word and get more people listening. If you'd like the links to Katie's work, you'll find them all in the show notes, especially the cult of CrossFit and her work on estrogen and fitness. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks. See you soon.